Debjani Bhattacharyya is an assistant professor of history here at Drexel. It's really nice to have her in the Philadelphia area. Her current research addresses two broad questions. The first, how environment and ecological formations shaped law and economy from the 18th century onwards. And second, how the contingencies through which legal and economic imaginaries developed and globalized across the world in turn, reshaping colonial environments. In particular, she traces how geographies of the colony, rivers, seas, and swamps, seasons, which were different in the temperate climates of Europe, shaped the legal and economic technologies during the period of European expansion and colonization in much of the rest of the world, particularly in South Asia. As you will see, her work focuses on the Bengal Delta as an important site for this work. Etienne Benson is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Sociology of Science, and he is a historian of environmental sciences, environmentalism, and human-animal relationships in the 19th and 20th centuries. His first book, Wild Wilderness: Technologies of Tracking and Making of Modern Wildlife, showed how electronic surveillance technologies to study and manage wildlife challenged understandings of wildness and wilderness in the 1960s. He's also published shorter studies of squirrels, national parks, environmental satellites, electrical power transmission, ecological simulation, and several other topics. He's currently pursuing two new book projects, one tracing the history of environmental ideas and environmentalism since the late 18th century, and the other exploring the role of the built landscape in generating ideas of human-animal difference. So thank you so much for coming, and with that I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's really interesting to be a historian in this crowd, although I do worry that with the rise of fascism, you all shouldn't give historian the last place and the last word.
The last word.
Never, no. But I'm glad at least the two of you will go after me to help me think through some of the things. So in some ways, we've been talking about the future, and this takes us back 300 or 400 years back, not as far back as Dilip was pushing us to, but the place I look at was a place where the ground, what you were saying, how do we even begin doing our research where the ground is not fixed, where the ground is moving. And the place where my work is located is a place where the ground was never stable. It was always in a flux, and it's kind of interesting to think about it in the rubric of rising waters. So the larger question of this project that sort of grows out of my book, and a question I have not yet answered, it's not something I flag in the book, I could not answer, is what is it about these kind of swampy places? And I can take the case of in South Asia or India, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, all of these are built on swamps, not like the pre-colonial cities, are also very speculative cities. Why is it? And the place I am coming to is, and we can think in terms of New York, we can think in terms of London, it is not necessarily. There is a transport question, of course, there is a question of aesthetics, but there is perhaps something else. I have a hunch as a historian, and that's a question I'm trying to work out. I don't have an answer. So when I began my first project, it was very much an urban history project. That's why I call it Drawing Calcutta. And it began, but it was not about drawing at all. It began very much with an engagement with the historical literature, where there were two ways of looking at colonial urbanization. One was the large epidemiological frame, which we all know about, like the colonized spaces or the native places or the black towns are always dirty and nasty, and they have to be razed, slums have to be demolished, taken out. It's very, that was one group of scholarship. The other one really looked at the first war of independence in India, which was in 1857, which resulted in a lot of militarization, or what is often understood as housemanization. And Napier was the guy in India, Napierization of landscape. And the idea was, that was done to segregate, that was done to break through the rebellious part and all of that. And all of this is great, and I am it's not like I'm necessarily in disagreement with it, but I often wondered, where did all this money come from to raise? So what's the political economy of demolition? What is the political economy of erasing landscapes? And I went to the archive looking for all these cases where this would answer, I looked at lots of high court records from, and every court record I went to, I found something about marsh and dispute about marsh, and I was really irritated. I was like, okay, maybe it's all about dispute. And then I was in this small bookstore in Calcutta, and I found Soak. And then I felt very angry when I first read the book, because I was like, okay, so I have to take the question of marsh seriously, actually. And it's kind of surprising, because if you really land in Calcutta, and my house is actually very close to these Calcutta wetlands, I had been living around these watery marsh, but I never saw it. And that then I really went back and said, okay, let me take out the marsh files. And that's how, in some ways, my project began. I'm trying to understand. So maybe the property dispute that I was looking for, there's a larger ecological question or a landscape question. Or this is a picture from 1937 floods. But I just like this. Hunter did a lot of things. He wrote about the peoples of India, but he also used to do census. But I like this quote here: the perennial struggle between, like he's talking about Bengal and the Bengal Delta, and he's saying here the perennial struggle between the earth and ocean goes on, and all the secrets of land making stand disclosed. So my book anyways began as a history of forgetting in the Bengal Delta, a forgetting that enabled human design in the world's largest delta and one of its most vulnerable landscapes. From the 18th century on, colonial law, bureaucracy, technology eclipsed and erased the secrets of landmaking and unmaking in the Bengal's sea face, where land dissolved gradually into the vast and turbid waters of the Bay of Bengal in order to build colonial Calcutta, the second capital of British Empire. In the post-colonial moment, this amnesia has turned into hubris, where the aqueous and the igneous elements are now being transformed into landed concrete property. Such is the aspiration of Atmosphere. That is the book that will come out, but that is Atmosphere, the building that you see there, that big building that you see there, which, as you see, is rising from water in some ways. And it is built as your home in the clouds. And it is Atmosphere is selling the promise of glistening new apartments projecting into the skies in eastern Kolkata, and they call it the first sky sculpture in the world. Architectural design, along with India's emerging aspiration to be part of a global information economy, manifest themselves as these homogeneous smooth spaces of new satellite towns flanking Indian metropolises, often erasing their fluid ecologies. In eastern Kolkata, skyscrapers sprout out with unimaginable speed, tiling the landscape with these uninhabited speculative properties, often owned by wealthy absentee landlords. The ambition to reach for the clouds of this ethereal atmosphere is not ironic, given that many owners are simply buying up air in hope of future profits. Yet this shining built landscape of glass, steel, concrete and air, waiting to turn solid, is also hiding its own secret beneath it. These seemingly solid structures are standing on liquid land. There's a term in Bengal, in the legal language of Bengal, called Jola Jomi, and there are lots of restrictions of whether you can build on Jola Jomi, and I hope the architects of these people don't find out I call that liquid land. I don't use the term Jola Jomi because I would get into trouble. Because it is illegal. Even 30 years ago, much of this terrain was wetlands and served as home to fishermen and farmers, 19th century colonial officials, but also to these commuters, travelers, inhabitants of the city, and never far from the smell of the salty bogs that flank the deltaic city of Calcutta. Yet the citizen and city's planner too often forget the delta and its salt marshes. So the Hooghly River flanks Calcutta's western banks. This is a very old map from, they claim it to be from 1690, hand-drawn, but from memory. But these came out of navigation, like sailors' diaries, where they are trying to alert you to the sandbanks. And this is, of course, a very recent Lancet map. And you see, so Calcutta is a part of a three kind of delta. So there is the Ganga Delta, and there is a this whole area, Ganga and the Brahmaputra and Meghna Delta. And each year the rivers carry about 40 billion cubic feet of silt on their journey down to the Bay of Bengal. The marshes, the bogs that make a patchwork of soil and swamps of Calcutta have left very few traditional records for the historian. Urban marshes, floating watery soils, riverine sedimentations were not always property, but instead had to be made into property. Landmasses in bays and coastal areas have a very different relation with water. The landmass flows, moves, challenges our fixities of cartography, ownership, and territorial sovereignty. The mobility of the landscape became central in forging laws addressing ownership in the deltaic city. The making of the property in marshes meant drying the marshes through hydraulic engineering, but simply drying did not secure tenure tenurial allodial rights, titles or deeds, or even dry the landscape, because it is not a dry landscape. How did these temporary landscapes enter the domain of colonial urban land documentation and become part of the burgeoning property market? To answer this question, we must first investigate how property is created in marshes. And one of the things I argue was forgetting was central to the creation of property for the extraction of value from the marshes. So, this shouldn't be here, but anyways, this we'll just stop there. So, this is actually what I wanted to show you. So, sometime in even 1940, much later, Strickland, when he was talking about deltaic formation, he also wrote, he was an epidemiologist also, he wrote a lot about epidemiology. Interestingly, about Bengal, this is what he says: one cannot get far with town planning without knowing the behavior of the matrix in which the foundations of the work are to be set. And this is surely the case in a country like Bengal, where the face of the earth is more or less in a state of flux. So something changed. What the part I'll present is I'll present this very unpresentable chapter, and I'm sorry you have to read that. But the part I look at is in the middle decades of the 19th century in this paper. And that is when, of course, municipal bodies are really establishing themselves in the colonial city. They are revamping infrastructural work in a very major way. And for the first time, they are trying to think of infrastructural measures not as ad hoc or stopgap, but as profit-making ventures. And something we often forget, like how much of infrastructural ventures are about where will the money come from and what are we going to get out of it. So it is at that period I see something sort of changing, because for much of the early period, like urban property had led a very inconspicuous life. And what they were doing was like, how do we drain, how do we put little drains, how do we make an argument to say this is actually not clay and silt, but this is actually land. If there is new deposition and the river has shifted, how do we make a claim on that land? But things change around this time, and that's what I'm looking at. So what I say, a techno-bureaucratic regime of draining began to create new forms of land value and valuation in Calcutta from 1840s onward, laying the groundwork for the emergence of a radically different urban economic geography. By the 1860s, extensive parts of the delta had been drained and legally zoned to create dry docks, wet docks, urban parks, canals, riverfront property. These changes for me elicited two questions, as I said. Through what means did the colonial government fund this project? I call this both licit and illicit means. And how did these then create new ways of seeing land where perhaps there were no lands? And that is kind of what dogs much of urban speculation in a place like Bombay or Calcutta, because if you look at these marshes, they are basically real estate in waiting, and it is a practice where you fill in this and you build. So how did this come about is a question. How did this, like, not being able to see what's there, but see something else, see something that can make profit come about? This was also a period, and this is the period before this, there was a lot of legal experimentation. And one of the things that they did during this kind of legal experimentation is develop very, very strict laws around how do we classify land. And there is a very distinct division. There are accretions, there are alluvion, there are derelictions, and they have very detailed kind of, from the 1800s, they develop very detailed kinds of regulation about ownership, which is different from agrarian ownership, which also has a very specific. So there are three major draining projects at this time. The first, which kind of fixed the cartography of Calcutta, but also changed the relation between land, water, but also property in very significant ways, and it impacted the land market. One of the project was to reconfigure the southern part of Strand Road and into an extensively fitted harbour. So this is basically all of the western part of Calcutta, which lies along the river. And I think this is the picture that I should be showing now. So that's the river running through it, and what you can see is, if you look at the dotted line, that's what the river was in 1793. By 1916, you see the straight line. So the movement of the river, which they tried to fix, gave them a lot of, there's a lot of dispute about the silt, who owns the silt, and not only that, how do you control the silt, and if there is, when silt deposition started happening, because they thought once you occupy, you get the silt, but of course the silt constantly overwhelmed all kinds of infrastructure. It's whose duty to clean the silt? It is not the municipal's duty. It is then suddenly you occupy someone else's silt, but then it becomes your silt, new silt. So there's all these debates happen. So your silt, my silt, that's happening in the early 19th century, and by then they start like fortifying this. The Fort William, the place where you see, that's also a big maidan, like a big 333 acres of open green space, which was basically also kind of, it was just kind of a forested area, which they cleared out, built a fort, used that kind of a low level to make a glacis, where you can like fortify, it was used as a fortification, and then there were this entire project of draining that space. And then they also tried to link up all the small canals into a linked system with the river, exactly what he's saying, like to make all these canals flow into one another for the drainage. The canal project actually did not ultimately got forgotten, and it's again now being revived in some ways. But one of the things that's very interesting is the canals up to 1895 generated something like 13.8 million rupees in profit. No one exactly knows, like it is very difficult to trace where did this profit go, because it was not going into necessarily back to the this was not part of home charges, which is like money basically transferred back to England. This was also not part of municipal profit. So it is basically getting funneled back into a property market, and that's the kind of thing that I was trying to trace. What is more important is around this period, this is also a period when British Empire is going through massive financial problems, because it is trying to occupy Afghanistan, which is very expensive. It is trying to build massive infrastructure and public works, which is also very expensive, and there are lots of financial crises happening in the empire because of what's happened with the silver mine crisis in Mexico. So what's happening is they have to look for new forms of taxation, and one of the things they decide is they need to bring the urban regime, especially Bombay, Calcutta and Delhi, which have now become Bombay, Madras and Calcutta, which have become very thriving kind of colonial towns. These were basically little markets. They were there was never much there. These were not the traditional South Asia towns. These are colonial, very much a colonial cities that get built. They bring those into taxation structure. So this is happening. The infrastructure is generating money, and houses are now being taxed to generate money, and it is creating some sort of very, very speculative real estate market, which is very interesting because by the 1910s and 20s there's a huge rent speculation crisis that's happening in Bombay, in Calcutta, in also Rangoon at this point of time. And one of the things they talk about in Bombay that actually results in housing riots, and in Calcutta they're terrified, and one of the things they constantly say is Calcutta's expansion stopped at a certain point, and it stopped at a certain point because the wetlands are not being properly utilized. And so one of the recommendations in fact that come out of the rent committee is who is a good developer of the city, who is a good philanthropist of the city. A good philanthropist of the city is who uses his private capital to actually develop these swamps into housing for the people, the way they were doing. At this time there's early reclamation projects happening in Bombay, and they are really trying to understand what is good developmental projects. So so for me this moment is kind of like, this is what I'm trying to struggle through, and this is why this paper is very unpresentable, because I go into various details of how the economic geographies produce, what sort of ideas they are using about taxing land formations, taxing, getting rid of pilferage in river, turning it into profits. I won't go into that. Poor Etienne had to read through all of that, but this is the moment where all these little things are coming together in this, developing this kind of understanding. Is like a good urbanization is an urbanization that can actually build over these kind of fluid ecologies, because that is like the answer to housing the poor, the problem of housing. How do we house the poor? How do we house the factory workers, the mill workers? Is by developing, and a good developer would be that, and that has sort of kind of went on into the colonial moment. So the two things I do is show the legal developments that happen in trying to see alluvium, marsh and all of that as land. There is of course a history of draining and technological projects of draining, but they're never really successful. I think you showed some pictures of flooded Bombay, and like early narratives of Calcutta are like, oh, Calcutta becomes a sheet of water in monsoon and remains like that from June to September, it still does in certain way. It's not like these draining projects have ended, but what we've done is we've learned to understand that as a problem, and we've learned to see water bodies around Calcutta as something to fill up and develop, and some of the most expensive housing in Calcutta are in these water bodies. And that's the interesting thing. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to tackle. So I will end my presentation here, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So, contrary to what Debjani was suggesting, this was actually a real pleasure to read. I learned a lot. I'm not sure I have so much to add, so I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief. I just wanted to start by quoting from a question that the description at the publisher's website of for Debjani's forthcoming book, the first question that the sort of short description of the book starts with, because I thought it was a fascinating kind of leading question, if ever I saw one. The question is, what happens when a distant colonial power tries to tame an unfamiliar terrain in the world's largest tidal delta? It doesn't end well. And it's, I think, from what the bits and pieces that I've heard or seen of the book, I think Debjani is giving us a deep history of that story of what, in some ways, is a wild success for certain kinds of speculative capital, and in other ways is a disaster. So I thought what I'd do is just maybe provide a couple of kind of historiographic framings or context for what I understand Debjani's this chapter in particular to be doing, and then just end with a question or two. So, in the paper that I read, there's two key terms that I think gesture towards two what hitherto have been very, very separate bodies of scholarship. One is indexed by the term property thinking, and the other soaking ecologies. Right? So I just want to say something brief about these two. So to start with property thinking, there is a ginormous literature on this subject, which I would never claim to have any mastery of, but I just want to gesture towards some of the ways in which scholars have thought about imperial and capitalist modes of governing land and making it profitable, making it valuable. We can think about histories of enclosure, from the Scottish Highlands to a lot of other places, colonial theories of terra nullius, justifying kind of conquest of land, providing a legal justification for that. We can think about various kinds of, when we kind of narrow the aperture a little bit, or focus in a little bit tighter, we can see various legal and market-based strategies for privatizing and economizing land, so establishing land tenure regimes that allow land to be bought and sold and traded and speculated upon in new ways. And we can think about the literature on the commons, or the impossibility of a commons, right? We can think about everything from Garrett Hardin to Eleanor Ostrom to 1,000 other brilliant scholars working on these themes. And I think one of the things that Debjani is doing is showing us a difficult edge case for making property, right? Not taking the easy case. Well, I don't know if it's that easy, but the easy case of taking an agricultural field or a pasture held in common and seeing how that gets broken up into pieces and sold off to the highest bidder, or taken control of by a coercive state, whatever, right? But looking at something that's very marginal, very hard to control, that isn't even by some classifications land at all, right? And so I think it's a fascinating case study for building on that existing literature, thinking of property thinking. I know very little about the history of Calcutta or India. I do know that there's this book by Ranajit Guha, A Rule of Property for Bengal, an essay on the idea of permanent settlement, published in 1963, a classic work thinking about how land was made valuable, made profitable. And so there's an interesting way, I think, in which there's a long tradition of property thinking, which could begin with, I don't know where it begins, with Ricardo or before, or with some of the actors that you describe in this paper. And in some ways, some of this thought, all the way up through Guha and up through your own piece, it's sort of a continuation in some ways of his thinking. Like, how do we understand how land gains value? And of course, at some point, there is a critical reversal in that tradition, right? Where these liberal neoliberal ways of making value come in for some heavy criticism. But nonetheless, I think it's a very interesting way in which there are continuities in this long history. But I think what you're doing in this chapter contributes some things. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you know this literature part a lot better than I do. It moves us from a traditional concern with rural agriculture, with peasants and taxation, the growth of a kind of agrarian capitalist class, right? The kinds of things that I think Guha was mainly concerned with. Shifts our focus to urban areas, right? And that actually dramatically changes some of the stakes, right? Because you're no longer talking about agricultural production, you're talking about the conditions for trade in goods and land and speculation on urban land property. There's also a transition that Debjani is tracing over the course of this chapter from a mercantilist kind of profit-taking system to these infrastructures of empire and imperial governance. And that seems like a really critical transition to trace. And I think some other people have done that, but I think what's really distinctive, or begun to do that, done parts of it, but I think what's really distinctive about that is trying to take that story of making value from land, and bring it into dialogue with the soaking ecology as half of the story. How do you actually tell that story in a way that's sensitive to the local ecological and hydrological conditions? Okay, so one historiographic frame would be that history of property thinking. The second I wanted to talk about was kind of histories of water. And my own background is as a U.S. environmental historian, so that's literature I'm most familiar with. There's been a ton of stuff written about water in the United States by historians. This has been one of the favorite topics of environmental historians. And so what I want to do is just trace very, very briefly and very schematically my understanding of how that literature has developed since, say, the 1970s, and where I see Debjani's work kind of doing a useful intervention into that. You might start with heroic stories of the conquest of nature that we can see, often written by practitioners, hydraulic engineers, colonial administrators, dam builders, dam promoters, boosters, right? There's that kind of literature that the conquest of nature is a good thing, it's going to make us a lot of money or make us healthier, whatever. The U.S. environmental history as a field was in part founded on critiques of that, specifically in the domain of water management. You look at you take a classic conflict, the Hetch Hetchy Dam in Yosemite in the beginning of the 20th century, Gifford Pinchot versus John Muir. This is one of the set pieces of a lot of traditional kind of environmental history courses and textbooks and so forth. You could also look at Don Worcester's Rivers of Empire, published in the mid-1980s, or Mark Reisner's Cadillac Desert. And then you can kind of continue the line all the way up through, and I'm going to pull in a few things that are maybe a little bit more disparate, but James Scott's Seeing Like a State, David Blackburn's Conquest of Nature, focused on Germany, Paul Josephson's Industrialized Nature, which has a heavy emphasis on the Soviet Union. And all of these are essentially critiques of attempts to control and manage nature, particularly attempts top-down, large-scale, grandiose, gigantic attempts to control nature. And I would say that for several decades, from the 1970s to the 1990s, this was really the dominant way of telling water stories, right? This kind of critique of the overweening human hubris, right? That we could control everything. Sometimes linked to a critique of capitalism, but I think in retrospect often a fairly flat critique of capitalism. Capitalism is like the kind of big monster capitalism with the giant C at the front, that you don't really need to specify in place because we all already know what it is. So there's a lot of that in that literature, even though that literature is also great. What I think has happened in the past couple of decades in the environmental history that I'm familiar with is a kind of useful progression forward from that. And a lot of that work has been drawing on histories of technology and histories of science to kind of not just to critique the human domination of nature, but to critique what happens when we think nature and humanity are totally separate, right? So it's been kind of blurring, complicating, and entangling those categories, making us realize that a lot of what we understand to be our environment is always already technological. A lot of what we understand to be technological or artificial is deeply imbued with various sorts of non-human forces and actors, right? So the literature that's emerged has really complicated this easy distinction, easy dichotomy between nature and culture, or between kind of natural rivers and controlled water. And I would gesture towards works by people like Sarah Pritchard, who's got a book called Confluence about the Rhone, Eve Buckley's Technocrats and the Politics of Drought and Development in 20th Century Brazil, Helen Roswadowski's work on the history of oceanography and other literature. And what this does is it kind of shows that these boundaries, these economies are being reshaped over time. They're being kind of constructed, not in a kind of social construction, cultural history mode that we might also associate with maybe the 80s or 90s, where it's all kind of in our imagination and it's all in the way we talk, but constructed through human agents that are embedded in broader networks of agency that include various non-human forces and factors. Okay, and so I see one of the things that I see happening in the chapter that I read was a way of showing us how the water-land border and how the kind of value and significance of water and land is itself constructed through what could seem like fairly technical, boring practices of taxation and law and engineering and so forth, and how out of that emerges a particular understanding, not a universal understanding of what water and land is, but a very particularly situated historical understanding of what that is. Okay, so property thinking, soaking ecologies, new ways of thinking the nature-culture divide. Okay, let me just wrap up with a quick, let's see if I can find it. It's the one with all the scribbles on it. So a few questions. So one thing that I felt uneasy about, even though I totally sympathize and believe it, was the use of amnesia and forgetting. It's clear that you quoted I actually have exactly the line that you quoted to us. I also snipped it out and quoted it, right? How the technologic of draining cultivated amnesia about the soaking ecologies of Bengal. And I wanted a subject, like a knowing subject. I wanted to know who it was, who forgot, right? But of course you also use the language of episteme, right? When you're talking about a particular kind of episteme associated with political economy. And that would suggest a kind of Foucauldian mode of analysis in which you don't necessarily need a knowing subject. You've got like a pattern of discourse or something where it becomes unthinkable or something like that. But I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I think the world's more complicated than that. I don't think like a whole society or a city forgets, right?
Yeah,
And in fact, I think you're showing us a bunch of people who are busy not forgetting at all because every day they wake up and they got to go out there and like keep the dike standing or keep the water flowing or argue over taxation rates with somebody. And those people don't forget, right? They're working on that every day. So is there a way to tell a more complicated story? And I'm not saying like give us a bunch of stories about traditional indigenous or local forms of knowledge that like contrast with that, right? I mean, you want those too, right? But is there a bigger story that runs all the way from the late 18th century all the way up to the present, where certain people get to forget because other people are forced to remember all the time, right? And who are those people who are remembering? And I think that could be a story that's more than just, and I will wrap up in just a second. I think it could be a story that's more than just a social story. It's more than just a story about how like the underclass has to remember and the upper class gets to go to the movies or whatever. But is also about the materiality of it. You have this one line, which is almost a throwaway line that I really liked in the paper, which was, the drained water must go somewhere, right? So there is a material story of what happens to the water that some people are getting to forget about. That physical water actually goes somewhere, and then other people are forced to deal with it. So would it help to learn a little bit more about that story? And then I guess I'll just have one other kind of question or provocation, which I feel like I'm allowed to do because you put up a picture. You have your book cover is present day Calcutta. So does this help us understand climate change? I mean, have you thought about this? Have you looked at this? How like speculative real estate is adapting to the imminent or already ongoing effects of climate change? Does this story tell us, like, is this happening in reverse? Or I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is the kind of question that I hate to ask a historian because the right answer is I'm a historian, I don't know. But I still want you to speculate. Anyway, I thought this was really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Should I respond? Or? Okay.
Sure.
Great. So thank you very, very much. I think you really summarized my project very beautifully. Thank you so much. Seriously. So I will go back a little bit. So I'll begin with the climate change story. So this is what my students said, Professor, are you a climate denier? And I said, no, I'm not. But I want to say that this was all happening since like no matter how far I've gone back, as far as I can, some of the early, like there is a amateur history of Calcutta. and it's written by a person who claims to be of a fisherman caste, and he is trying to remember the city, and he sees waterways, and he talks about how there are waterways, and he moves with a fish, and he follows the fish, and he moves with the fish, and basically how they moved along with the natural, how I interpret natural drainage of the river and its or the landscape of, and the watery landscape of this area, because it's not really, so the why I said the canalization project failed, it's like retention ponds was what I was thinking, like there are these big spaces of water that are dry in December, and then they are full of water for most of the time. So this is probably a picture taken during monsoon. They look like monsoon clouds, and this is not like it. Of course, there is a problem with the building up of the floodplains over here. These wetlands actually act as flood protection, but at the same time, I want to say these wetlands were also, the wetlands that I talk about were also created somehow in the 1920s and 30s, when people from the other side of the river got displaced, and following partition, when a lot of people from the villages of Bangladesh came, and all they knew was how to live with these kind of watery landscape, and they created, which has acted like floodplains. So to give your answer is, two things I try to do. I try to say, like, of course there are big dams and all of that have created a lot of problem for India, but this propertizing tendency has also, like, you cannot harden the first thing we need to do to build property is harden the soil. Sometimes a rice cultivation doesn't need hardened soil, and even for the British, because they had to deal with landscape coming and landscape disappearing, landscape coming, the idea was, if the land, suppose your land disappeared, your 2 acres of your farmland disappeared, you would be taxed in that way for 5 years, because the land might appear again with the next monsoon. That was the idea. It's like landscape is seasonal over here, but a built landscape doesn't know how to live with a seasonal landscape. Whereas going back to the Mughals, there was an imagination of a seasonal landscape in the agrarian. So you never measured according to landscape, you measured according to yield. And if you could give me a decent yield, I didn't care how big or small, but if your land had been disappeared for 12 years, or if new land had been there for 12 years, only then it entered the revenue rolls. But that sort of a elasticity cannot enter a built landscape. And that's where I actually go to. So that's what I was trying to do. So you in a way you sort of picked up, because it does change the stakes when you move away from this agrarian history of property into an urban history, because like urbanization needs this kind of solid land. And so what I try to show is the slow kind of building up. And climate change is such a big question. Of course, Calcutta is I think 2 centimeters or 20 centimeters or 2 meters, God knows how much meters below the sea level. I should know all of this terms, but this is also the thing, like, I don't know if people are thinking per se about climate change in India, or at least in Calcutta. I shouldn't say about India, but at least in Calcutta. They keep talking, they like, if you get on and say, oh, one day everything will disappear, but everything disappears. There's this fatalism, like things disappear and all of that. What they are thinking about is that there are organizations that are working not to develop this part of the floodplain, because they are very worried, precisely because it's a very different reason. These wetlands also are our natural sewage treatment, because it's a very big city with not too many sewage treatments. So there's this environmentalist who you also know, who passed away very recently actually, and he said, and I'm going to use a bad word here, he said, if we build up this very fancy speculative property, Calcutta will drown in its own shit. That is truly what will happen, because we have not made space to build our own sewage treatment, because these things, the water and the tropical sun does a lot of the treatment. Amnesia, you actually raise a good point. So what I need to clarify is, when I say amnesia, it's so comfortable to forget the water. It is so, like, this is what I think, this failure of imagination is this. It is easy to forget. For me, it is easy to, if I have spent money and saved all my money and brought up this sky sculpture or whatever this nonsense is, this is my life saving. It is so easy for me to forget. And if I can somehow live another, 40 years and without the water rising, I'm good. And this is something, there is this temporality, like we all, and when that doesn't happen, we think in terms perhaps of this failure of imagination. When my 40-year estimate has somehow not worked at 40, I don't want to be pessimistic, 100 years I'll live. So, but like when that has not worked out, so in some ways, I need to clarify that. I think there is a comfort in forgetting, because it's easy. It is like politicians don't want to think about it, urban planners perhaps at some point, but it is kind of expensive to think about it. What do? Do we uproot Like Philadelphia should not also be where it is. So what do we do? Like we have to not address that, right? In some ways, that's what I take your point very seriously. I have to, because there are certain people who cannot forget, and because Calcutta is getting developed, Sundarban is also dry, like subsiding, so at a faster rate than it should, the landscape. So there is that, some people will remember it much more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give some time for questions.
That was right behind
Oh.
you.
Well, thank you for that. It seems to me actually that you're working in a very interesting cusp of time. And I'm wondering whether you've considered this, cusp in mapping, where you saw the advent of astronomical mapping. That laid the foundation for trigonometrical surveying. And what that actually allowed was a line to be drawn through water and to register itself and to hold actually by the stars, by the celestial sphere, and not actually by the Earth's plane. So until then, actually, you had land holding lines, but at a time like this, actually from the 1600s on, you began to see actually lines drawn through water and property being sold actually in water. And so it's a history of actually urbanization that is shared with this country. Actually, we have read actually a number of folks who came from England and from Europe, I should say, to New Orleans and went back because they didn't see any ground on which to build. And so they felt that they were cheated. Actually, they were sold water instead of land. So it's an interesting ground actually thing, but I think it is primarily actually due to this shift actually in the mapping enterprise, and the ground actually of urbanization actually sort of was much more open to occupying the seas, and reclaiming was much more of an ambitious, was not anymore, I would think, an ambitious prospect. The other point I want to make actually is that if you think of Bengal as not a delta but as an estuary, the difference actually is significant because what planners had done and what the British did, they were pushing actually a delta landscape only because you can control ground in a delta landscape because you're wedded to rivers and formation actually of ground by rivers. But if you actually move into an estuary and you admit the sea into play, actually you're in a much more difficult situation. There was a man here, I guess he was the designer of the first Aswan Dam, actually, Wilcox, who wrote, you know him. Okay, he wrote actually wonderful 3 essays on the Bengal. I think, and he was actually convinced that the entire bay was constructed from Rajmahal down to 200 miles of construction of a delta landscape, canal by canal, actually over a number of years. But this is a guy who starts his essays actually by saying, I was born on the Ganga Canal, in a tent on the Ganga. So canal was in his head. But the idea that a delta can be constructed from land into the sea actually makes it a very powerful. But coming to Etienne's question actually on sea level rise, there's a lot of conversation here. And it's very interesting actually in terms of how mangroves are seen now in the Sundarbans, in the Sundarbans. And this is the fight actually between an estuary and a delta. The mangroves are fighting for their place in an estuary as a barrier to the sea. And so it's basically climate change is seen as coming from the sea. But this is a place actually that is confronted by a divide of the Faraka barrage that is causing the sinking of Bangladesh because India is whacking all the water at that point, and so there's much less water going to Bangladesh. So this is another curse of rivers.
Exactly.
I would think. But glacial melts. This is a place that is in shit.
It is, and it's not addressing. No, you're right. You're right. It's very if I can respond quickly to your. I really never thought of I've read your work and I read about the trigonometry. I never make that connection, but it makes complete sense at the birth of this is happening around the time that there is a shift in how they're looking at the urban. It's an economic geography. Urban space is an economic geography, not just a space of. It's a space of profit making from land, and the company starts also imagining itself as a land developer, not just a tax farmer. So it's very interesting. But about the estuary, I want to say something. It's very interesting. If you look at the kind of indigenous writing, so it's about there is this kind of a tortoise called Kurma who gasps out a breath from the ocean, and that forms it. And of course, like everybody says, it's a delta. Throughout the colonial period, and so that this doesn't, or any kind of like the Borahami's writings about the Bengal Delta doesn't work because it is a sea-facing writing, and it talks about this land being formed by the sea, whereas it's a land formed by the river, which now I was recently. So I actually use the word estuary a lot, but the book, like I talk about the estuary and how the estuary is not part of the engineering discussion, because so much of colonial geology is delta thinking. And of course Ferguson also, like I think they were committing James Ferguson, who writes a little bit about it also, along with Wilcox.
I learned about Ferguson from you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So earlier during Kian's session, we talked a little bit about kind of the boundary of the idea of the city, and what is the city, what isn't the city. And here you've mentioned several times the East Calcutta wetlands as kind of as the thing that processes the sewage, as the land that hasn't been filled yet, and therefore is not yet real estate. And it always seems to be kind of like in this other state. And I'm wondering if there's also another way of seeing it as actually a incredible example of this ecological infrastructure, right? Which is an urban aquaculture filtration wetland, which is treating over 140 million gallons of sewage, producing over 100 million pounds of fish per day, employing 40,000 people from the city. And if it were to be built over, like you were saying, then the sewage treatment basically stops.
Exactly.
And so isn't that as much part of the city?
It is,
But I feel like in the representation, maybe it also has something to do with the fact how it was built basically incrementally over 100 years by Indian fishermen, basically under the noses of the British.
Exactly.
And was never mapped. And therefore even Google had trouble initially mapping it.
I didn't know.
And so it's kind of this invisible infrastructure that seems apart.
Exactly. No, that's something you bring out a very, very valid point, because I live very close to the East Calcutta wetlands, and all I smelt it. That's it. It was this stinky bogs we have to hold our nose and drive through. No, seriously, you don't see it, but that's one thing I actually write about in my introduction is, so much of urban history comes out of looking at municipal maps and how much our municipal maps govern our imagination. That's why I use these maps to talk about Calcutta, because we cannot think of Calcutta without thinking of these harbors that connected Calcutta. And in some ways I think this comes in, unless you think the city from the water, you only see this built up area as the city, but the built up area of the city is sustained by all these waterways. So I begin by looking at a harbor that was built, that was supposed to be the closest to Calcutta, and it disappeared. Because that's the only way you can make these things, like what sustains what we call the city. It's not about additive project of saying, oh, this should be also part of a city, but it's like, what are the things that got erased out of us seeing this kind of. So I take your point, but this is me saying, I don't think most people in Calcutta think of it as part of the, apart from the developers who are making a lot of money trying to
dire outcome for the system.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So you hit it. Yeah.
Thank you.
In present day Calcutta's land making sort of happening primarily through the speculative development. I guess I was thinking about the story of Calcutta in relationship to I know the kind of similar history in Mumbai and Lagos, for example, and think about that in relationship with Teresa Caldera's recent article about kind of auto construction and transversal relationships with the state, and which isn't just about the kind of urban poor making land. It is about the urban poor making land by any means necessary, but a whole kind of continuum of land making practices, which I know in the context of Mumbai is it's very interesting how things move from not property to to property and who's doing that kind of
Yeah.
that kind of work.
Yeah.
And because this is a kind of long history, it also reminded me that actually in the case of Mumbai and in the case of Lagos, I wouldn't be able to tell you when kind of non-British or kind of master plan style swamp drainage and land making starts to happen exactly. But it seems like an interesting question of if there's a point we can kind of find when it's no longer just the engineers who are making land in that set of kind of relationships. So convoluted question about the kind of history of kind of collaborative distributed land making practices, as well as kind of what's driving land water change in present day Calcutta.
Well, that's very interesting. Like, so I'm thinking master plan, because what I see in the archive, and this is also like heavily a colonial archive, because that's where you see records. Also, is some of these very early ad hoc projects are actually done by the French, the middling colonizers. They couldn't be a tax farmer. They quite don't know. They have some skills, but not. They get kicked out of Calcutta. So they start actually the project of, there are these kind of ad hoc kind of what I call the middling figures of colony. They do this precisely because if you build public infrastructure, if you were somebody in the Mughal regime building public infrastructure, you had a claim to the state. So that's how you made your claim to the state, because then you could draw taxes from the public infrastructure. That's how you might make your fortune, because you're probably not coming out of the gentry in England either. So these are the figures, and I think the first kind of the making of Worli was, I guess, the first kind of engineering project that they did in Bombay, and they were trying to replicate in Calcutta. What's interesting in the case of the wetlands is, and this is what makes it very, very complicated, is it is not where the poor people are living. It's not where the poor people are making money. This is actually a Ramsar protected site. You should not be building there. So what's happening over here is politicians and urban developers are involved. So how it might happen is you might give land to a school, and part of that land would be in that zoned Ramsar site. And then the school might extend, and then it slowly extends, and then suddenly housing crops up. It's only after the housing and the fancy places crop up, then you see the vendors come in with their carts to sell food and things. And what's happening is the people who are living there without necessarily building up the land, like people, as he was talking, the fishermen and the people who actually do kind of aquaculture, they are getting displaced. So it's a very different. It is not not necessarily, and this is happening precisely because our debates, with municipal debates and our finance department debates have projected this, like a good developer is a developer who develops these land, because they always compared Calcutta to Bombay and said Bombay is expandable because it's a sea facing. Calcutta is shut in by rivers. And that's very interesting, because that's when the reclamation work was happening. So you can extend, but if you have rivers, you cannot extend. That's the imagining. I don't know how to explain this, but there is this. I think this is the hegemony of the line that prevents these people from. So they think like anybody who can do that sort of an extension, and they think of Calcutta as landlocked. And the answer to this is like the idea initially was to get the poor people out of the city into that, but of course it is the most like expensive part of Calcutta, because it's also kind of like a crazy city with its traffic, so you just go there, it's hassle free. Our airport is there, so but it's interesting to think. Actually, it's in some ways to think with Caldera's work, because it's almost a counterpoint to. But there isn't like a stage of land making where, like in the case of Mumbai, a stage of land making where it would temporarily be an informal settlement. Does that kind of happen in the? And then get replaced. Not in the Iska, because this is Ramsar side. It's heavily like protected side. Actually, the people protesting the development are often the fishermen and the people working over there. They are the ones protesting that landscape. Thank you.
Shall we take maybe one last question? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I was just absolutely fascinated, and I can't wait to read the book. I wanted to go back to this sort of question from before in Kian's presentation about thinking beyond the city, and I wanted to ask you to think maybe like even a little bit further beyond the metropolitan area, because I've done sort of similar research in the exact same period, but below in the delta, below Calcutta. And what I think is really important about what you're doing and what's important about thinking beyond is that Calcutta is just like Philadelphia and London, like we talked about before. It was a port city built on a river, and it was built to facilitate extraction from the agrarian hinterland. And not only did that mean that the entire hinterland, basically Bangladesh, was quite radically transformed, but also that all of the canals within the Sundarbans needed to also be controlled in similar ways that you're talking about here, and that control is something that people in Bangladesh and in that sort of deltaic landscape below the city are continuing to grapple with. And I mean, this is a slight stretch, several sort of political, economic dynamics that have happened in between here, but in response to this question about how do we see climate change in the picture that you showed of Newtown, those buildings, which are under construction in the picture that you showed, are being built by migrants from Bangladesh who are being called climate migrants. But are in a lot of ways just labor migrants, And so I was thinking, in terms of like unthinking these lines and what are sort of our amnesias, it seems to me that the links between Bangladesh and India post-partition are really important amnesias that need to be interrogated and thinking about what these how we see Calcutta beyond Calcutta.
It's very interesting. Also, the people you have to remember who live in close to these Kolkata wetlands are actually also like the 1940s migrants. From Bangladesh, the first wave of migrants, like the refugees, not sort of migrants, but the refugees from the partition who lived there, which is also the South Calcutta, now the more wealthier part of Calcutta. But I think you asked me a very good question, which will send me back to the archive again, the control of the canals, which I have to like look at how that was. Like I know there was a lot of what was the big threat that every time I read about the canals was there was what they call rice bleeding, because they were transporting rice, and what you would do is, because you wouldn't get much money, you would slit some of the gunny bags and the rice would just enough for the rice to fall in without sinking your little craft. And so they were always trying to control that sort of craft, but this is in the colonial. But I think there's a larger ecological story about the canals, and also I think a lot of these canal routes got closed, became border areas, but of course fishermen were always transgressing and getting caught in each other's lands. So there is a larger story to it. I'll think about that. And some of my next work is trying to link riverine histories to oceanic histories, so I will be looking at Well, thank you so much. It's a very good question.
I think we should thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and especially to you hardy souls who have been here for every single presentation. It's just remarkable. Your fortitude is inspiring and invigorating, and we will do our best to emulate your great presence. We have been thinking over the course of a couple of years now, but really intensively over the past 24 hours, about these kinds of axes, various axes that we thought might be helpful to tease out, that would allow a kind of comparative thinking between some of the papers and sites that we heard about today. So we sketched out some of them that we were thinking about last night, and we've been refining them also, of course, over the course of today. And I think we have 5 that we want to kind of suggest to you as ways, sort of gradations, axes along which we would invite you to think with us from your particular location and then into a gathering conversation.
Right. Thanks. And maybe like one of those axes that came out very powerfully right at the beginning of the day with Dilip's presentation, but also at the end with both Dominic and Debjani's presentations, is this issue of like remembering and forgetting. I think what Etienne called amnesia, right? And the kind of work that's sort of needed to sustain amnesia. Work not necessarily just by marginal residents, but also some of the most powerful authorities of the city. The amnesia you require to draw lines, the amnesia you require to make them real and keep maintaining them as real. So that might be one space to like think comparatively across the papers around memory and forgetting, and how those projects are made.
I was telling Etienne during the break, I was particularly glad that he brought up the active forgetting. I think that is a really important thing. We sometimes think of forgetting as passive, but of course it's often hard to forget. And we heard a lot about that, how hard it is, that active work of not talking about what you don't want to talk about, particularly in Dominic's paper. And I think that's something that we can flush out as well. We want to tie this forgetting and the increasing inability to forget, maybe, that we're all being bitten with at this point, with questions of temporality, and not just time horizons and time scales, but actually the speed with which things seem to be happening. We heard papers that suggested we need 2,500 years to think about these questions. We heard other kind of demands from Houstonians saying, like, I need the data right now. But then again, even if I have all the data that I could ever ask for, would I even have enough? And then this feeling of being stuck, which is its own kind of time. This like in between paralysis. So we wanted to invite you to think about your own projects in terms of that particular access.
In and around questions of time and questions of slow noticing, there are also projects of speculation, right? And I think Debjani's paper brought this up very actively, but also Dominic and Liz's work around questions of the vitality of speculation out of the muck that we're in, but speculation also as a tremendously profitable activity to remake and inhabit or make firm muck, right? And here I'm thinking a little bit about Kathy's presentation when she's drawing our attention, when she's drawing our attention to the ways in which muck makes you move and inhabit landscapes slowly and deliberately, which was, I think, really profound. I'm thinking of the work of historian Rudolf Mazek, whose work in Indonesia described the pleasures and the powers of hardening ground that you would actually be drawn into and drawn in, right? The projects of making roads was about producing a new kind of agentive authority on the landscape and in landscapes. And I think what the important point here is that the speculative project of making a road out of muck, out of mud, was not just a project of colonialism and empire making through empiricism, to think with Dilip, but also something that was desired and something that colonial subjects found desirable, right? The pleasures of occupying that brittle road. This is in a chapter called Language as Asphalt, which is, I think, a agentive way to think about speculation in mud.
Yeah. And tying in with this discussion about speculation, I wanted to invite us to, again, think about the kinds of the different speculative, more or less speculative world-making projects that we've been talking about, right? And I was thinking in particular, Debjani mentioned this just now, how do you think when the ground beneath you is literally moving? We've talked a lot, we've drawn from a lot of imaginaries that have to do with colonial imaginaries. We've really been talking quite a lot here about the past. I'm wondering, Nikhil and I started this morning by thinking about what are the kinds of knowledge communities, future-looking knowledge communities, at a moment of crisis that we might think about for future world making. I'm thinking in particular about speculative fictions, for example, the types of archives one might draw from to imagine a place beyond paralysis or other than paralysis. We were talking last night about Salman Rushdie, of whom I'm an enormous fan, and he, of course, one of his maybe lesser known works is The Ground Beneath Her Feet, which is about earthquake. And I just think about, it's interesting to me in this conversation that has so much to do with speculation and world making, that we aren't really hearing about literary writers. And so I'm thinking about these other types of communities that might, knowledge communities that might be linked with our works. And finally,
to return to where we began, in some part, the structuring of this day, where Lib drew our attention to these historic processes of line making and cartography and solidification. We in some ways returned to those questions of Debjani's presentation, right? And so these questions around history and how we orient ourselves in history, we can think of it as a linear, are we going backwards in time when we started with those flood projections that we began the day with of Mumbai and Philadelphia. How do we account for histories amidst, how do you account for futures amidst the death of somewhat teleological accountings of history? How do we account for history not moving forwards and backwards, but perhaps doing something else across time that is not as linear as we would like to make it linear, we take it seriously?
Great. And with that, we won't cold call on anyone. We'll just invite responses, thoughts, and the questions, of course, that you have been so busily writing down all day and saving up for this very moment.
I thought maybe we put forth just an observation actually on the nature of the presentations, and I thought there was a kind of a divide actually between presentations that were led by ground and rethinking ground or thinking ground, or whether it was in historical terms or whether it is in some kind of reading in like Bhattacharyya. But then there was also this sort of event-led thinking, which was of a different order, I thought. So Dominic's presentation, for example, sort of led by the structuring of an event, and then but each one of these, I think, is a very different way of thinking about by which you come to climate change, or thinking about where our agency lies, I would think, and I thought that the event-based, or even though it can shake us up, tends to be sort of rooted more in the problematic, versus the ground, which actually allowed more for speculative thought, actually. And but that, I don't think I would actually draw that line, and it's more a line in the sand, I would think. But yeah, that's just an observation actually that I found it sort of interesting in how you approach rising waters.
I'd be, of course, curious to hear, Dominic, what you have to say about that. But in terms of thinking about agency and alluvial agency, or whatever term we might want to determine, I still want to come back to this grammar of "I flooded," and I actually wasn't thinking about it the way I think, Dominic, that you were thinking about it. But I'd like to check with you, which is not like I flooded. It happened like I was flooded, like passive construction, but like I'm the flood, like I'm flooded. And that to me seems to be much more a radical shift of we humans are also the weather, right? Which is of course also true. So I don't know, I just wanted to return to that. I wonder, like actually in that understanding of that grammar, I think that event-driven piece is a more radical rethinking of what human subjectivity is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a very good point. If I can just chip in there, because I think it is the kind of question that I sort of asked, where did the event end and the consequence begin? Because you sort of provoked that. I mean, and I'm glad you sort of brought that up, because I think it does sort of move from consequentialist thinking, at least as a designer. I mean, I find that planners are just rooted in that, and the measures then that come out of it are very sort of, sort of just prepare you for the next flood, as it were. Whereas if I had to think about it in terms whereby people are associating with it, or grounds are being associated with it, then consequence begins to get absorbed. And it's a very interesting way of thinking about resilience. If you think that there are no consequences, that the consequences are part of the event, then you live in it as opposed to living on it. That is, I agree. I mean, and this perhaps is an interesting way of using an event to lead perhaps to a ground, as opposed to thinking about speculative grounds leading to accommodate events, So it's, I don't know if you have your thoughts on it, I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I mean, okay. I want to get back to the issue of the speculative that you mentioned, Bethany, a minute ago, because I think to me that's really critical here. I'll just start by saying, as somebody whose work kind of, both as the center director and personally, kind of straddles the social sciences, humanities, and arts a little bit, as a social scientist, I look at I flooded and I say it's just a contraction of I was flooded. It is a passive construction. And then it's again about the world did this to me, and I'm kind of without agency. But I like, as a humanist, and maybe especially as an artist, to think about I flooded as being a kind of a moment of potential radical rupture, something you can work with. You can say, let's work with that idea of I flooded and what that means, and how something like a storm and a flood or multiple flooding makes us rethink our where our watery bodies contained by these little bits of the skin bag, actually are part of. And I think of this as being there's so much great feminist, eco-feminist philosophy right now. Stacey Alimo is somebody I find really inspiring, that are precisely asking us to re-examine our kind of ontologies of being in those ways, right? Of re-embracing our wateriness. It seems like I flooded is a moment where you could do that, right? Not to even mention that, there are other kinds of leakages happening. There's crying, there's like all sorts of other exchanges of fluids that I think happen in the process of coming to term. So I like all of that. It brings me around to, I think, why the failure of imagination, and maybe there's a way of getting past the consequentialist forms of reasoning. And with Houston, it's not. It would be great if they were consequentialists. They're always looking backwards, trying to figure out what happened before. Like, how do we plan for the flood that just happened, not the one that's going to happen next? Because they're not even taking seriously the consequentialist line of inquiry. But the way I think about it is this. I mean, we need the arts involved. I think we need, broadly speaking, representational arts, speculative arts. At some level, we need those. We need the memories of the future that we want to find and the ones we want to avoid, because otherwise we've just got the memories of the metro-modern past, which are full of pleasures and luxuries, and very difficult to imagine. I think another form of paralysis is this idea of whatever the future is, if it's not based on petrological assumptions, it's going to be a world of want and absence and pain and suffering, and so this idea that you could be happy with less, you could be happy with a smaller house, you could be happy with no car, these are kind of unthinkable assumptions in Houston. So how you get from point A to point B, I'm not 100% sure, but this is why I think we need to enroll artists seriously in our projects of speculative. So what I would love to do, and this event here and these conversations have really made me think this ought to be a priority for us, is really to find people who want to explore with us possible watery futures of Houston. In a sense, in the maybe tragic dimensions of that, but also the ways in which these can produce a different form of life that is not necessarily a lesser form of life than what's come before it. And I'd love to create ways for people to experience that, and whether that's working with people to create game designers to create worlds we can move through with whatever kind of fledgling VR technologies are available to make that possible, or whether it's through literature. I mean, we have models. I was thinking this whole day, what better proof of concept for the importance of speculative work than something like Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140, which picks up on a lot of these issues we've been talking about and works with them, or even, maybe not quite as great a work of art, but still very interesting. Bhattacharyya's The Wind-Up Girl. These watery futures are fascinating. So I would just say, it's really just to underscore what you said. I think we need, and this should be a project that us environmental humanists are really committed to, is to work with artists on really ambitious projects that when people encounter them, it forces them in some ways to encounter possible other futures. I think that would help a lot to unlock some of the failure of imagination.
Yeah. Can I, sorry, I'm going to butt in just for a second because I want to tie what you're saying. I couldn't share that sense that we need to work really in a major way with artists. I think I couldn't share that more strongly. And yet you might remember this morning I started with this sinking art project. And so I want to come back to that actually because I was so struck. I was really glad, Ben, that you picked up on that. And so I have to do a little bit of introduction, which is that our current artist in residence is in the back, Jacob Rivkin. Hey, Jacob! And Jacob has built a number of floating and watery projects, including a biopool that we did a community build for this past June, right, Jacob? And has led into his floating archives project. More on that. But I wanted to come back to Ben and to, because you really, I thought, helped us think about, it is really traumatic when these speculative experiences or experiments go awry. And I'm sure that in Lagos there was a sense of deep, it was a project that was so inspiring to so many people. Can you talk more about that, failure, as it were? And I'm thinking about the good fail. My larger question is we also need to fail. Yeah. We also need to be able to fail and have it be okay. And so a friend of mine was but good failure is really important, but bad failure is catastrophic, right? So I guess I'm thinking about what's good and bad failure in speculative work.
Yeah, Kian and I were just chatting about that project a little bit, the Makoko Floating School. In Lagos that collapsed. There's a really nice long-form article by anyone who's interested in the project by a journalist named Alain Gastel, who kind of does the prehistory, which actually included Ben Stiller traveling to Lagos and being interested in this semi-aquatic amphibious community and wanting to invest. And there were other architects, and the architects didn't play well together. So, what I see is kind of a question of what kind of investments and hopes are being invested in a speculative project. It seems fairly clear that in the case of the floating school, the community, it never really functioned as a school from what this reporter kind of unearthed, that it was kind of all photo opportunity driven. I myself, as someone who studies Lagos, found it very depressing and discouraging, and this kind of collapse of the kind of possibility for utopian interventions, or for a different kind of a softer line between land and water in a city that's also literate and sensitive to habitation styles that aren't facsimiles of anywhere else. And I think it's kind of burdened in that case, whereas your project is not burdened with what it is to have experimented in a community of the urban poor who have seen many urbanists kind of pass through and suggest one thing or another. I was just kind of the idea of we can make things float. If things that float keep collapsing. That just is it's just a question of where what kind of desires we're investing in that particular style of intervention. But maybe the Lagos case is also a cautionary tale of kind of the urbanist and the researcher having certain kinds of desires for a city that may not be in sync with urban dwellers in that city itself. And then maybe aside from that, it's what kind of speculation allows us to kind of like our hope is fragile in speculative projects, and pursuing those speculative projects can make that hope dissipate. That's what I sort of learned from that.
I may just jump in on that. I think what's really generative from what the conversation between that Dominic and Bethany are having, also that Ben is thinking with, is to think a little bit, to spend a few minutes thinking a little bit about water as a site of habitation, right? A lot of what we've been talking about today have been water perhaps as empty threat, or water that is exiled and pushed away, water that is empty of different kinds of social practices. But of course, most waters are very heavily inhabited by infrastructures, but also seafarers, also scientists that are doing work in the sea. Perhaps even think about the forgetting that we need to do to remember that government workers are also inhabiting these very liquid margins of the city to make it dry, right? It calls to mind also work that, I don't know if Amy's here, she's an undergraduate from the class, who's thinking about how like floating settlements in the Mekong Delta are seen as backward, but when they're seen in Holland, they're seen as forward-looking, and this juncture about past and future that I think is at stake at practices of watery inhabitation. But it's also something I think that Dilip and Anu have worked a lot with coming out of the SOAP project, right? Designing with wetness and with temporariness and with open-endedness. And if you can say a little bit about the experiments that you were seeing or putting into practice or imagining as different kinds of intervention, imaginative interventions on what might be a more fluid city in the future.
It's interesting you ask that because I actually wanted to make a comment on your question on history, and and maybe this will tie in with that, and Dilip, correct me if you don't agree with. But like we assume that history is linear, and so and there's also a divide between historical, certain serious kind of planning study versus speculative work, and in some ways we don't quite divide that, and so at least we believe that when we are always looking at history speculatively. So it's always from here is that what is the kind of history we are mining. And so when we were working on the SOAP project, we are also historians, but we said there's a particular way we wanted to look at history so that it becomes, so the present, we can shift the present. So let's say if our history was based on a certain island thinking of the margins of being firm, we said we can go back and look at the archives, look back at things and find a completely other history, which made the case for what we wanted to do. So it wasn't as if there was a sort of firm history in place and that we had to now kind of displace it. We realized that we had to actually rewrite that history in order to make room for where we wanted to go. So in some ways it had to be a kind of a natural progression of the history we were writing. And I would say it's not any more speculative than the history we had inherited. So, this whole question of amnesia versus, like in some ways we have to kind of erase that. In that sense, I think when we've sort of talked about speculative work, we always sort of talk about art as art before science, in the sense that we are not as artists representing what scientists have already done, or we're not there to visualize for people what is already, sort of the known. It's how can art, which I think it can do, open up new questions. And I think that was sort of very much where we sort of landed with that. So in some ways it was less thinking that we were being speculative in the sense that we had to show demonstrative proposals about what would this way of thinking lead to, rather than thinking somebody's realistic and we are speculative. That wasn't the divide we were making.
I was also going to say something about teleology and history, but I think in some ways Anu has given a much better answer. One thing I was thinking of when Dominic, you were presenting, and I know this is a question also I had to both of you also. I was thinking about air, and I'll tell you why I'm thinking about air. Because we get torrential rains, and I grew up with torrential rains, like really bad rains, and then we have water. But I was in New York during Sandy, and I realized how the role of air, and I'm sure Harvey there was the element of air there. But people, and I think that's when you I think was asking, I'm flooded or I flooded. I was thinking of it, like that's when you started pointing it, I was thinking of it, why did the air go missing in the discussion? Because one thing I realized when I came here is when the rains come, they come with huge strong gusts of wind that we don't often see in, like there are cyclones in nor'westers or whatever we call them, but it's not like rain doesn't necessarily have to come with air, like these gusts of wind, but Harvey, Sandy, there was a lot of wind and air, and I was thinking, how do we also make as we are thinking in terms of fluid futures and all of that, how do we make accommodations for air, and how we should not perhaps, or if anybody was talking about air or wind, or how also in your project, like is there a space for air and wind, because that's also feels so critical in this. Yeah.
So, as you know, I work a lot, I collaborate a lot with an atmospheric chemist, Peter DiCarlo at Drexel, and he asks me this question all the time. He's like, why are you so fixated on water? Get over it. And I think there is really something that, I think, Etienne, you and I had a conversation that I'm only recalling a little bit about, why water all the time, you know? And I think it's a really useful question, you know, and I think that it came out a little bit actually when in Kathy's comment on Dilip's paper, when she tried to she teased out the hydrologic cycle a little bit more and talking about the you know, the gaseous and the fluid, and there's something about fluid water that is so tangible, that we've made it is so tangible, we can, and it's you know, then it becomes deliverable, it's, you know, and it is somehow the easier. I think maybe I'm not imaginative enough, and for me it's easier to think with than air. But I think that I've been thinking a lot with some other atmospheric chemists who are thinking a lot about air equality and air inequality. And that has been helping me a lot as I think about it. I was thinking about air too, and this is something I just don't know enough about, but when you said, I thought that was so evocative that you said, you know, well, I mean, I knew the wetlands were there. Like, I would jump in my car and plug my nose because they're smelly. Yeah. Like, that's coming through. It's this kind of, you know, wind. Like the way the wind is shifting. And that is very much an experience that members of this Google Corps, this, you know, gathering of researchers talk about all the time when we are on the water. Which way is the wind blowing? What does it smell like today? And I don't know what to do with that, but it's there. You know? Yeah.
So one of the many things that I've done recently is work with folks in coastal Louisiana who live outside of the flood wall, and a lot of people who live in that space live in elevated homes. But I visited one community where that had been fairly decimated, like by several different storms back to back, and many of the people in that community chose not to elevate their homes because of the wind. So like the threat of water is always there. The river is right next to this community, and they rebuilt the school like 16 feet in the air for all of the students who live in this one tiny little town. But people chose not to elevate their homes because they're like, well, if the water comes, like I know how to deal with that. But like if the wind blows my house and it like falls off of the pilings that I've like built up to elevate to keep myself safe, like what good does that do me? I like now like everything is splattered all over the place. So I think it's also interesting to think about how the communities that we work with also are thinking about these different elements and the ways that they engage with it, responding to, adapting to, and as communities and also as individuals.
I'll just jump in there because I think that's such a good point, and that's something that reminds me a bit. There was a similar, I don't think there were people on Staten Island who weren't elevating for that reason, but people talked about it a bunch, and people tended to talk about it, I think, there as a way to signal, you know, they would say like, oh, they're making us elevate our homes, but then what happens if there's a tornado and they're making us get rid of our basements? What does that happen? And it was sort of for them to signal all the ways that like there was such a reductive view of risk and vulnerability, where there was like this focus on like one particular form of risk and kind of erasing all of the others that also were factoring into the decisions they were making. So I think that's really
Rachel?
I guess I'll just sort of piggyback on that as well, which is I've done a lot of work in the Hampton Roads area, and I think it's a very similar question. I know you talked a bit about Rob Nixon's work on slow violence, and that to me is so, like reading that book and thinking about my experiences in the Hampton Roads area, like they're so inextricably linked. People are scared about the next big storm, they're scared about the fact that like state managed shelters can hold like maybe 10%. of the capacity that's predicted in the event of a major storm event. But that's not the problem. It's the problem right now is that people in wheelchairs can't get where they need to be going, and parents can't pick their kids up after school when they get off the bus. And to me, that's, I think, something that like we can re-inject more in these conversations maybe, which is that conversation about the slower, sort of more like maybe mundane feeling violences to us, but then when we're like doing what they would have said, which is like really heeding community voices, what we can hear is that maybe the thing we think is the biggest threat isn't, but that slow sort of persistent violence and that slow just sort of like mental drain, like some of your interviews really evoked, is really sort of maybe one of the more central violences that's occurring because of climate change.
Ken?
So one of the things that's interesting that to me that's that's coming up in this conversation right now is the question of like what we prioritize depending on who we are and what we study and where we study, because you intro this thing by talking about how we look at things in different ways, right? The book on uncertainty and your objective to have a kind of cross-comparison type of study. That cross-comparison is like site-driven, it's also knowledge and discipline-driven. You're deliberately trying to do that. And it seems to me that like, no matter how good researchers we are, we privilege the kinds of things we know and the kinds of things we get to know. And I think it's pretty problematic, right? Because like no matter where you go, you'll find something somewhat different. So like what are, how do we then come back and say, well, I mean, all these things are somewhat important, but like what else, where else can we go from there? A couple of things follow up, and then often I do think when hearing about other places as well and other research, it's like, well, what's at stake here? Like, what do we really care about? Like when we talk about, and Liz and I have talked about this, when we talk about the Staten Island East Shore, what do we really care about? Like, am I particularly concerned that a homeowner on the east shore of Staten Island is able or not able to be compensated to retreat? I don't know if I care. Like in the bigger picture, like I'm not sure if that is the problem that keeps me up at night. I think the research is super interesting and brings up ideas about climate and resilience and adaptation that I've totally not thought about. That's generative and productive. The consequence, I'm not sure yet. And in the same way, I'm thinking about things like, why we think that people should be compensated in order to leave their homes, when part of, like the kind of American dream to begin was people being able to do whatever the hell they wanted in their own lot, right? And so there's like a tension between liberalism in the American, like the kind of American, classic liberalism, be able to have like control and agency over our individual rights and the rights over the things that we consider ours, like our land and our house, and these broader issues that we're trying to consider. That's like, it's a productive area of tension.
Yeah. Jill?
One of the things that sort of preoccupy us, in this question of why water, and I think we're also sort of fixated to some extent on, but we, as you probably saw in my presentation, moving away from water to wetness, precisely because we find that water is bound to land, and we continue to be land-centric in our perceptions of it. So I find that, for example, in the art project that we saw, the floating one, the failure, and we were talking about accommodating failure, it's a very land-centric driven measure. Failure is a very land-centric measure in itself. I would think that this is where the sense of resilience that comes from living within is much more in tune actually with wetness than it is actually with the land-water divide that automatically sort of assumes a certain land-centric behavior, actually, because it comes from land-centric thought, that I'm on a geographic surface. So I mean, I think if you put wetness in that kind of an environment, I feel that it becomes a critique as much of the way we look at art and the representative role actually that it plays in changing imagination. And so this is one of our major concerns actually, and that is why we look to what we call design research, or as we just learned in Edinburgh, I think we call it research by design, and that is actually that you put forth possibilities, and it's a kind of a testing out. I mean, and so we inhabit possibilities. I mean, Anu put it sort of different. I mean, I think I would put it a little differently. Come on, that. I mean, if I look at the past, I look at the past for possibilities, that I can harness, and so it is not so much that I look to history. I look to a possibility, in the past, and I mine it for things. So, for example, in Bombay, I said the history of Bombay is anchored in a past that is bound to an island, and I drain an island. So I actually have to dominate water in order to actually make that ground. But if I change it then to actually looking at an estuary where there's a lot more flux, I accommodate the air, I accommodate the ocean, I accommodate, there's much more of wetness in that world, then I am actually looking at the past differently, and I'm asking, where is the estuary actually in all the writings? And I find it's totally absent, and then that's why when Anu says we rewrite it, I wouldn't say we rewrite history, we rewrite our past in order to accommodate a different future. I mean, we are designers, so we don't go by any authenticity, I guess. We work in a fluid world, let's say.
But even the historians, post Hayden White, do we all not just accept that the past is actively constructed as much as the future? It's
not me, man.
There's not.
I know how it really was. I think we have time for one last question. I was gonna call on Raka.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Raka.
Oh, okay. So first of all, thank you for all of these amazing talks today. It was very generative. So our conversation about wind was making me think back to, I took Anand's class last semester and worked on Sandy in New York, and we found this really amazing wind map, which was really funny because it was cut exactly around the U.S. continental border and showed you everything that happened during Sandy with the wind inside of that, that landscape. And I showed Anu this and she laughed because I thought it was very cool, but she was like, well, first of all, just think about all the things that are going wrong here. What it ended up was, it made this moment for me where I started thinking about all the different perspectives. So if you look at Sandy from above that way, it says one thing, but if you look with it, if you go down further at every different level, it says so many different things. And to tell the whole story of a storm, you have to include all of those perspectives, which I thought was interesting in terms of what Philip was saying earlier about the two different perspectives we look at today. But also from this map, I really learned or thought through about the entanglements between wind and water, because the winds during a hurricane are also very, very wet. So how does that work? And not only during a hurricane, but at all times. And it made me think back to what Philip said during his talk today about, I think he said geography is where wetness can become water. So I was thinking about how that brings us to so all of these moments, if you think of, or that we looked at today in terms of geography and specific places, how are they interconnected, and how does water and wetness, how does that serve as a framework that we can see all of these things in one geography? Does that make sense as a question?
And I think, this is also where, and go back to what Kian was saying, comparison becomes engaging again, right? Or becomes a site to think these questions of one and many. Do we inhabit one world? Do we inhabit many worlds? Right? Which is a constant set of debates in anthropology over 150 years, but also I think in geography, particularly because these colonial disciplines were disciplines before the disciplining of disciplines, right? And so to some sense, in some sense, like one of the projects that we're trying to do here is a project of comparison on one hand across different disciplines, as we've been doing here today. Bethany has this very generative framing of distant disciplinarity, like the kinds of alliances and collaborative projects that can be made possible across a professor of German history and an atmospheric scientist, for example, right? But also comparisons across distant what are seen to be imagined as distant geographies, right? And this is the Ranganathan and Balsa speaks. But I think what all these projects build on is what Dilip pointed to very astutely in the morning, is a shared kind of understanding of drying wetness as good, as improvement, right? This is a long 300-year-old, or maybe even longer history of making spaces desirable and habitable. I think it's helpful to think across. But comparison can also be generative precisely because the comparisons are unlike. And here I'm drawing in Ranganathan and Balsas's work, which is that paying attention to water ecologies in California and Bangalore, as Ranganathan does, Alni does, also provincializes the kinds of expectations and political institutions we take for granted as given and all there, right? So why do we see people making claims of environmental justice in California and and demanding better water quality when that demand is not so present in Bangalore, where they're demanding access, forms of citizenship, right? And so that gets us to in some senses, provincialize and historicize anew from here different kinds of arrangements that we wish to unsettle in our projects of imagining anew. And if that's
I think
generative.
That's super helpful. I also, and I know we have to stop, but I want to come back to this the question of care and attachment, actually. And I like this film of making a film about a glacier that nobody really cares about, and it seemed to resonate to me about like Houston, nobody's really attached to it. Like, so if it becomes the first like mega ghost city, like, will anybody really care? And I think, John, what you're saying about this question of like, who are we actually, like, who do you actually care about, is also kind of a comparative framework that we really need to think through on like deeply ethical, with ethical questions as well. I would really like to thank you all for taking the time and care to be here. We have wonderful refreshments for you to wet your whistle and fill your bellies. So please do join us for some libations, alcoholic and other, and some snacks. Thank you all for wonderful papers and questions. Thank you.